Thank you, Mickey. And I'll indulge the patience of the room to say, I'm just going to say hello, and then I'm going to turn off my camera because I've been a bit under the weather, and I'm afraid that you'll just see me coughing and drinking tea through much of my presentation if I leave my camera on. So I'm just going to turn it off for the presentation. I'll come back at the end so we can talk and answer any questions you have. So I will, but you've got my slides. I want to make sure you can see those okay where you are though before I turn off my camera. Can you see this first slide
Yes,
successfully?
we can.
Okay, fantastic. So bye from the video, but I'll be back at the end. So let's get started. There's me. You can still see me for a moment then before we go any further into the slide. I wanted to I did put a little note on here to myself in the little airplane there because I wanted to remember to say thank you for your hospitality because in the last 2 months, I've had the pleasure and the opportunity to be in your fair state for a couple of different visits. My colleague, Lena Hernandez, and and I believe Lena is here also participating remotely today. We had the option to go to Mississippi County, the library that just went live. We were there in Charleston, Missouri in late March. We also visited Ron. Hi, Ron, who was a great host for us while we were there too. And then just last week, we spent the week in St. Joseph. So thank you for being such wonderful hosting state. We've enjoyed seeing two different parts of the state now and look forward to spending more time with you in Missouri now that on-site training has resumed. I guess I should say, Mickey introduced me. I'm Jennifer Weston. I'm a product and education specialist here at Equinox. I've been here since 2019. Ironically, I started here at Equinox just a few months before the partnership between Equinox and Missouri Evergreen started. So I feel like we've just been kind of growing together. And I feel a very special kinship with all of you. So thank you for having me here today as we could talk about permissions. So Mickey kind of answered the question I was going to answer here, but why am I the one talking about the Missouri Evergreen Consortium business item on the agenda? And it's just that it's a consulting project that we've undertaken. And Galen gave a great introduction yesterday to the kinds of things we do as Equinox, partnering with you. And one of those things is consulting projects. He mentioned some of those we've worked on in the past, from things like patron privacy and data security to looking at your transits and travel distance. And this is one more of those projects, and it's one that we kicked off at the first of the year. So a consulting project is just that. It's one that's contracted for a specific scope of work. It's outside of the standard business that Missouri Evergreen does. It's dedicated to just the routine supporting of libraries and growing the consortium. This is when we really just focus on a particular thing that affects the entire consortium. And the project that I'm working on is permission groups. So we all wear many hats. So while you may know me in a couple of different roles in the Evergreen community and in working with many of your libraries here, this is yet another one that I'm very passionate about and glad to be part of. So this project specifically started with the scope of analyzing all of your current permission groups and all of the permission assignments. And we'll talk about why that is such a very large task and why it takes a consulting project to be able to tackle it and to also provide direction for where you might go from here. The second part of that, of course, is just we analyze the existing permissions and permission groups and assignments. Then there was a written report that delivered to the board in February that just kind of documented the current configuration and functionality. I should say my slides are available on the schedule now if you want to see these. And also the most recent report to the board is available. So in full transparency, that's there if you want to see some of the assets of the work we've done already. Those are available for anyone to see. And of course, we did a live presentation. We've talked to the board a couple of times now, I have, about this particular project. We still have a little more work to do, of course, but we're well underway. Again, January and February were analysis and a lot of questions and answers, and March and April have been working on recommendations. And then we're glad to present it to the general membership today. So I thought I would start with some very basics to kind of put us on the same discussion platform to talk about permission groups. You can't talk about permission groups without really distinguishing the fact that Evergreen really uses them for two different purposes. You've got patron permission groups and you've got staff permission groups. Now we've tackled both of these. And when we started this project, we were looking at permission groups, all of them. And you'll see that we really had to kind of review them with two different perspectives. And I'll first introduce patrons and then introduce staff and talk about where we're going with each of these. But I wanted to mention that while we looked at patron groups and staff groups, one of the things that became very clear to us also, as we were working with incoming libraries at the same time this project was getting started, is that, of course, your staff, all of you, are both of these things. You have patron cards and you have staff accounts. Your staff account's clearly what enables you to do your job and do all the things in the staff interface you need to do. Patron account, very much that. How you would personally utilize the collection. So that's one of the things we had to tackle, is how can we make that a little clearer, both in the group structure and for libraries that they're coming in and trying to make decisions about how they want to set up accounts, both patron and staff. So we added that to our list of things that we wanted to cover. And of course, saying that you have two does not mean that you're limited to two. Many of you have more than one staff account, and that's perfectly reasonable and for all very good reasons. For example, in Mississippi County, recently when we introduced simple reports, one of the questions that was raised is, can we just have a reports staff account so that we can actually share simple reports, which is something that was talked about yesterday, to where there's really not a way to share simple reports unless you share a login. So for that reason, you may have multiple staff accounts. Now, of course, this project was not about making suggestions for how many staff accounts you may want, but instead talking about the permissions that support those. So starting at the very, 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 very basic place with permission groups is, where do you find the permission groups? Whether it's a patron account or a staff account, it all starts at the very same place. It's on the patron registration screen. Most of you know this, and I'm not sharing anything that's new, but I like to start here. Your patron permission group is just that. If you have a staff account, you create it on the very same screen. There's just a couple of extra things that have to happen after that. So I'm talking about the main profile permission group and all the things that live in this profile group drop down, and the secondary groups note, this button on the right. So I'm going to talk about all three of those. Well, actually two of those, and how they work together. Not talking a lot about the expiration date, but I mean, you can see there that they just kind of go along with the groups. So we're talking about that profile group when we talk about permissions. So let's talk about patron accounts first. And I've got a list of them, and we're going to kind of go back and forth between what these do and what the recommendations are. So let's start with just the patron accounts, which is where we started in our review. Simply, patron accounts are there so that people can access your public catalog and library services. It's really that basic. But you do have to have a few permissions set up in Evergreen to say, okay, somebody's been given a login, what can they do? But beyond that, patron accounts are very much involved in the creation of defining your policies. As anybody that's been through an implementation in the last 3 years since partnering with Equinox, you'll know very clearly that if you've worked with Erica and you've worked with the implementation team, you know that those policies that you'll start with is defining your patron types, and then working through what each patron type can do with each particular different format, your circulation modifiers, your shelving locations, who can circulate what and for how long. So without patron types, there aren't, well, I'm not even going to say that. Your policies are based on patron types. So that's really kind of where we start. That's a little different than access, but it is very much about defining behavior. So it's not traditional permission in that way, because policies are created in a different place than permissions, but they are critical to them. Patrons are assigned a specific patron group for those reasons, defining the policies and giving them access, but they can be supplemented by patron statistical categories. This is something in cataloging sessions yesterday, Liz and Kate talked about item statistical categories, but if you're not familiar with patron statistical categories, they work the same way for reporting purposes. Anything that's not on that very long patron registration screen that you might want to report on, you can simply just create a patron stat cat for that. So you may not have a patron type that allows you to do that, but if you need to be able to track patrons for reasons other than your patron types, that's what patron stat cats are for. And we'll talk a little more about that here in a moment. So to reiterate, though, that means that only a single main permission group should be assigned. Oops, sorry, my Google's going crazy. Only a single main permission group should be assigned to a patron account. Patron accounts do not get secondary groups, and those are just for staff permissions. You can assign them, but nothing's going to happen if you assign a secondary group to a patron account, because Evergreen's simply not taking that into consideration when you're looking at defining policies or when you're looking at anything to do with their ability to access the catalog. All that's defined on that first main permission group. And there's your list. So Missouri Evergreen does have a single set of permission groups that you can choose from for your patrons. Now, you've done an excellent job of identifying and maintaining the single set of patron permission groups. And I cannot express strongly enough how important this is to be able to benefit all the members of the consortium, to help you share common terms. And as a cataloger, as a technical services manager, I'm all about consistent terminology, controlled vocabulary, and this is one of the things that makes me smile every day. Because with common terms like this, it makes communication so much easier between your libraries, between patrons who may visit more than one of your libraries, between your staff as you're talking to one another. It's also ultimately going to be one of the things that helps with any kind of policy review you may do, is because you do have this single, very well-maintained list of patron groups. That said, one size does not fit all. So I'm very surprised if any of your libraries are using every permission group that's listed here. In fact, there may be some libraries that just use 2 or 3 or 4 of them. But the important thing is that you've given the flexibility to choose what you need, no matter what type of library you are. If you're a small library and there's just 3 or 4 staff there, and you've got a pretty basic structure for your patrons, you really just need to know if they're a resident or not. You may want to know if they're a minor or not, but if you've got just kind of really streamlined policies and you don't need all of that, that's fine. But if you are a more expansive library system, you have multiple branches, and you really do need a more granular level of identifying your patrons, you can do that too. The flexibility is what makes this also very useful to consortium, because you're not trying to make all libraries look alike. And also talking about flexibility, recognizing that there is a very long list of groups that you may or may not be using. My question is always, would you like to limit the permissions group staff we'll see on that patron registration screen? We started asking that when we do training with the incoming libraries. When Lena and I were there in St. Joseph and again, Mississippi County, that was one of the questions we said. We said, look, there's this very long list on your test system, but one of the things you can do is customize that. And thanks very much to Diane. Thank you, Diane. I know you're there. I didn't warn you about this, but I copied the text right out of the email that you sent out when you started providing instructions on how to do this. And I think you did that in February as well. This is documented in other ways, but I love Diane's link here. And again, it's just an email. You'll have the slides and you'll be able to see it, but she talks about how you do this. And she gave Scenic Regional as an example. You simply go in and you say, these are the things I want to see on my list for my library, so that we don't use any of these others, and you don't want staff accidentally choosing something that you don't have policies for, which is what would happen if you don't limit that set. So I encourage you to look at Diane's documentation and the community documentation as well if you have any questions about that. So thank you, Diane, for that. And I wanted to make sure I shared it because it's a valuable piece of information. Okay. So staff, I'll say the same thing about staff groups that I said about patron groups. One size does not fit all. You also have a shared set of staff permissions. One library can have a set that another one doesn't have access to. So much like your patron groups, and we'll look at that list again. Same options are available to all. But again, one size, I'll say this over and over, doesn't fit all. And Missouri Evergreen is doing a great job investing in the time and energy to have conversations about what various types of libraries need. And that was one of the reasons we were tackling this kind of project now, is because staff permission groups are probably a little harder to explain, a little harder to define, even for people that have been here for a long time. Being able to clearly describe what is the difference between a local administrator and a global administrator and a system administrator, or what's the difference between a circulator and a circulator administrator. So part of this project is really undertaking a look at every single permission that is assigned to every single staff account and deciding what would best serve you as a consortium. And if we needed to break that out into clearer roles, do that and document what we need to be able to make these more accessible for you, so that it's very clear when you're choosing a staff group what you're doing and what permissions you're assigning. And say that to say that the staff permission groups are really just authorizing your staff to have access to do their jobs. And it's done on a role-based group definition, and you will have seen that already. I do want to say that you can have one or more secondary groups. I said patrons shouldn't, but staff certainly should. if they need additional permissions, like catalogers. One of the things I said, you start at the same place on that patron permission group screen. You know, everybody gets what's essentially a patron account, and then you just make it a staff account by assigning a staff permission. But there's one other thing you have to do, and that's that last bullet point here. Is staff accounts are assigned a working location to identify their libraries. Without that, and if you've created a staff account in the last year or so, and you've got some kind of weird message when they tried to log in that essentially said, I forget exactly what the message says, but they couldn't go any further once they tried to log into the staff portal. That's why you have to identify the working location. So you're essentially saying this staff person works at this library. This is what prevents you from being able to register a patron at gosh, I don't know, at Poplar Bluff if you work at Scenic Regional. This is what stops that, because you're saying, nope, they are a Scenic Regional employee. They are not a Poplar Bluff employee. Therefore, they should only be working on Scenic Regional patrons. And this is how you have working locations assigned. So those two things work in tandem. So you've given your what permissions should I have, and then also what library should they apply to. So I said there are a lot. As of version 3.9.1, which you are on, there are 637, give or take a few, different permissions. Okay, I missed that. Is there a larger number? It might be more. I always estimate 700, but do you want? Yes. So, and it's growing. It's not going the other way, because every time there's a new feature that comes out, there is the possibility that there will be a permission that comes along with it. For example, running simple reports requires a new permission. So what do we have to make sure we do is make sure that that permission gets assigned to the permission group that needs to be there. And we'll talk about one of our recommendations would be just that, is to make sure somebody's monitoring this. And as a good partner, we will do that as well. But when new permissions come along, when new features come out, we say, oh, look, more permissions that you get to decide who has access to do these things. For example, yesterday in the cataloging session, one of the cataloging sessions, I believe Liz was talking about the ability to update new cover images. That's a permission. So we can assign it to one of the cataloger permission groups that say, yes, particular people can do this, but not everybody that works a cert desk should be able to upload these cover images for now, until you work through how that process is going to work. Maybe never, but that's how the permissions assigned is with a permission. I like some of these detailed examples that kind of go back that I've used for years, though, is to give an example of how granular they really are, is that you have permissions to allow a staff person to mark an item as damaged, to mark an item as discard weed, and to mark it as missing. I use this because if you're familiar with the item status actions menu, those are 3 things you can do. But to recognize that there are 3 very distinct things you can do, that means each one of those things has to have a permission behind it. So I like that example. Equally true with overrides. There are all kinds of overrides that are possible, but there are individual permissions that let you override each one of those things that you may encounter. Like too many checkouts, can we override it? Yes. Somebody owes too much in fines, can we override it? Yes. Every one of those is a distinct permission, in addition to just the general functionality, like being able to upload cover images. So in addition to those 637 permissions, there's also the attribute that goes along with the permission. That's my word. It's not a technical word, just what I'm using now. But depth is the actual attribute that's there. It says, at which level should this permission be assigned? So yes, I can mark an item as damaged or discard. Let's stick with discard. Yes, I can mark an item as discard weed. Can I do that at the consortial level? Can I do that for all items in the entire consortium? Hopefully not. Unless you're the consortial cataloger, in which case, you should have that permission. Can I mark an item discard weed for my entire system? So am I the cataloger for a system of libraries that has multiple branches? Or should I be able to do this just at the branch level? So that comes along with every permission that's there too. There's also an extra part of this about whether or not you can grant that permission to somebody else, but I'm going to stick just with identifying the permissions and that depth at this point. If you remember, we talked about working location had to be assigned just a few minutes ago. A working location has to be assigned to say where your staff account is working. So If you happen to be a cataloger that is supporting multiple libraries, that means you have multiple working locations to allow you to do this. So that if permission says it's at the branch level, that's okay because you have the authority to work at multiple branches. Other than that, this is a very clear delineation about where those permissions should be applied. So it's a matter of making sure you have a permission assigned to be able to carry out the duties you're assigned, but then also make sure that you can do them at the level to carry out the work you need to do. So 637. I didn't want to spend a lot of time going through all the individual permissions. I'd rather talk through some of our findings here, but I am going to just very briefly hop out and show you this detailed grid that your board now has. And you probably can't see this on the big screen. It is shared and it's posted in there's a link from the slides, and then there's also a link in the report you have there. One of the things we did is we went through and we looked at your staff permissions and your permission groups. We did a count of how many of each you were using. You have 47 distinctly different permission groups. 21 of those are patrons, 24 of them are staff. And then we looked at what secondary permissions were assigned. I don't expect you to see all of that now, but I did want to say that one of the other things we did is that they now have a grid. I'm trying to move things around here so you can see all that. But for example, these are the general staff circulator and circulator administrator comparisons here. So we've compared every permission, and let me scroll so that you can see every permission. And I'm not going to keep scrolling. It goes down for almost 700 rows. It says whether or not that permission has been granted to, in this case, general staff, at what depth it has been assigned, and then if it was inherited or not. And I'm going to talk about inheritance here in a moment. So they have this massive, 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 massive workbook with lots of sheets in there so that you can turn on filters and see who has what setting. It does not make it an easy thing to navigate, but it is a massive layout of what we've done. So for this project, we felt like that was necessary, and it will be for some of the next steps that are coming up. So just want to let you know that that is there and available. And it was updated as of the end of February. So if anything's changed between now and then, I will just say that it is only good as of the end of February. So let's talk permission groups then and where they come into play. So you have close to 700 permissions. So of course you need permission groups, because what would you do otherwise if you had to assign a new account to a new staff person and had to go through practically 700 permissions and just check off which ones you wanted them to have? Nobody wants to do that. So the genius of a permission group is it does just that. It says, if I am a circulator, here is what I need to be able to do. And it puts all of those several hundred, I suppose, permissions together and says, okay, circulator, you can do these things. And then as the person making the decision about permissions, all you have to do is say, okay, I have a new staff person. They need to have circulator permissions, or maybe they also need to have cataloging permissions. It saves a ton of time. And you can also use those secondary groups. That's how they come into play. So it may be that you're in a small library and there's just a handful of you, 3 or 4 of you, and everybody practically just kind of does everything. Your cataloger does spend a lot of time just doing front of the house kind of thing, to use a restaurant term, but to do just kind of circ desk things. So maybe everybody very much is cross-trained and they need to be able to do everything. In that case, go ahead and give them circulator permissions and cataloging permissions. But if you're in a larger system and your catalogers are very distinctly different from doing circulation materials, and it would not be considered necessary for somebody that works the circ desk to be able to make any changes to a MARC record ever, that's the reason those cataloging permissions are considered a separate group. And the reason that you want to be able to assign or not assign secondary groups for that way. But you don't have to choose between circulation and cataloging. That's where the secondary group comes in. You can just keep adding permissions. Also, one of the reasons we're going through this is because we want to make sure that these staff permission groups are designed in such a way that libraries of all different types can pick and choose from them to make sure they meet your needs. Now I'll talk a little bit about kind of the hierarchical relationship with each of these permissions and how they work, to give a little more insight into kind of the decision making that's going into the review process. So you start with, and I don't have a test system up here, but I do have some screenshots. So you start with as users at the very highest level. The very first, this is right out of the box, Evergreen. The very first defined permission group is just users, and it has a very, very limited set of permissions going on there. Then below that, you get a patrons group and you get a staff group. I've already kind of discussed the reasons you will have two different groups there. You don't need as much for patrons need, again, limited permissions before you start getting to staff, but it all falls under this same tree. When I say tree, that means as you start working this, adding more and more levels to your tree here, more and more limbs to it, you inherit the permissions from the level before. So in this case, you've got users, and then underneath there, you have 8. All of these are in the same line, if you can see the little line there. So under there, you've got these 8 groups that live underneath users. They all inherit everything that user's permission can do. Even though it's just small, it keeps inheriting from there. So there are your 8. And we're going to talk about each of these a little bit. There's some ACT supplementary stuff going on. This non-circ and outreach, these are patron groups as well. Then you've got patrons. SIP is, of course, just for connecting vendor and other third-party services there. Here's your staff. Unique management, of course, is a vendor sort of thing. And then volunteers. So at the very basic level, this is one of the things we looked at and we said, is this really the hierarchy we want? And perhaps not. But it's important to realize that this is what you have now. That was our first goal. Clearly identify the existing state of things. And here it is. Those are your first levels. I'm going to walk through each one of those very, very briefly before we talk about the recommendations that came out of our review. So here, this kind of helps me. And again, this isn't a screenshot of Evergreen. This is my spreadsheet and the one we've been working with, the board, so that it can kind of clearly identify these parent-child relationships. So starting with ACT supplementary permission groups, recognizing that this is in and of itself something that needs to be reviewed to see if you really need this many acquisitions, permissions, and again, how many libraries are using acquisitions. I believe we discovered right now at Scenic Regional, maybe the only one currently using acquisitions, and St. Joseph that's coming in and actually in their testing process right now will be using acquisitions. So we'll be working on streamlining those. But because there's so many, it helps to make the point of, you'll start with this ACT supplementary permission group, which would inherit from users. You continue to add levels. Your basic selector would then have everything users have, and your basic ACT supplementary one. Your advanced selector would have everything basic selector had plus other things. And your purchaser would then have everything before that, plus a few more. And then here, finally, is your ACT admin. So ACT admin has everything purchaser has, your advanced selector, your basic selector. Kind of get the idea. How about you just keep layering on those permissions? Layering on means adding to. What it does not mean is taking away. So if you were assigned here at this basic selector a permission, you cannot at ACT admin and say, well, you know what, admin can't have that. It doesn't work that way. This is all about adding on permissions. Notice again, here's your non-circ, your outreach, and your patrons. They're not inheriting anything other than users. So anything that's going on in this acquisitions world is completely outside of that. Your non-circ at this point, outreach and patrons are all in a different hierarchy other than the users. Let me back up just a moment. See, patrons is kind of here at the bottom. So we've already talked about patrons, but here are all your patron groups underneath there. With the exception of, go back a slide, these two, your non-circ and outreach, I believe, are also patron groups, but they're not nested under patrons right now. Everything you see in that patrons list is here. So one of the first things when we looked at the patron groups, we said, you know what, we've got a really good set. They don't need a lot of permissions necessarily because they have all they need. They just need to be able to interact with the OPAC. And we've got a really good list. However, we've got a couple of alignment issues. And those alignment issues being, we got 2 things that live outside of our normal structure here. If we want non-circ and outreach to be underneath patrons, then we just need to move them under there. So that's what alignment means. You'll see that in my recommendations and our recommendations at the end. And the other thing we talked about was secondary groups. When we discovered secondary groups are being used for patrons, that's what I've raised the issue already. We need to consider stat cats if you need to be able to both identify a patron as a, let's just say as a resident, but you also need to be able to identify them as a school member as well. If you need to be able to recognize somebody as if your resident, non-resident doesn't come into your policies, then you don't necessarily need to give them different patron groups for that. If you just need to be able to report on how many residents and non-residents you have, then that's a stat count. You don't necessarily need that as a different patron group if your policies are the same for those two things. I'm repeating myself on purpose there, because just because you have groups that are residents and non-residents, if your policies are the same, it's fine. They can just be your regular old patrons as far as that goes. And you can just throw a stat count on there. If you find that, you're saying, I've got a patron that's multiple, that fits multiple categories, then you have to choose the one that's going to enable you to create a policy for that particular patron. So if I'm an outreach patron, does that policy trump everything else I'm doing here? I might be a resident, but I'm also outreach, and outreach means I get things for materials for a longer period of time. That's the policy I need to focus on. Then I can put a stat count on there to say I'm also any of those other things. So that'll be discussions you'll have among your libraries. Is when we look at those very specific accounts that currently have secondary groups, what might be needed as a stat count. So we kind of stopped with patron groups at this point. We felt like, there's not a lot of permissions to really look at. We've kind of looked at aligning some of this and seeing how they're currently being assigned. We're kind of happy there. We don't need to spend a lot of time with patrons. Our real time we're going to spend on staff accounts. And outside of that acquisitions group that was, kind of listed above there, you've got this other set of permissions, this other more central group of your staff permissions here. So again, you have a couple of acquisitions options. And you'll be familiar with these. There's your catalogers, and underneath that is your cataloging admin and cataloging master. I would say all catalogers are masters, but that's just me. In a permission world, that's not true. So again, just to repeat the way permissions are kind of layered. Every one of these, your acquisitions, catalogers, circulators, for example, they will inherit staff. So remember there was users up above here. I'm kind of waving my mouse above the permission groups there, but there's users above staff. So staff inherits everything users had. Staff could be your building block here. This is what every staff person would need. Then you start layering. So if I've got cataloger permissions, I get a few more permissions. If whether I'm a cataloging administrator or master, I inherit catalogers. But you notice these are set at the same level. Cataloging master does not inherit cataloging administrator or vice versa. They both start with catalogers currently. I might be putting a little bit of foreshadowing in there. Currently, cataloging administrator and cataloging master just inherit catalogers. Then you have your circulators and your circ admin. Same thing. Circulators inherit from staff. They have nothing to do with cataloger permissions. They're completely separate. And then your circ admin. And then we've got some other things there. Here are your three different sysadmin types: global, local system administrator, and system administrator. These are your, again, stock descriptions that come out of Evergreen, and that you would expect to see a global, local system, and a system. The challenge is in defining what that means for you as a consortium. What do your libraries need? And you've got to cover others that are there, data review and serials that are lingering. So the real challenge here has been, first of all, aligning again, getting everything under a staff umbrella, if you will, moving those acquisitions ones out from up the top, and then looking at all these various acquisitions so that you just have staff, and everything that's staff is underneath staff. But then streamlining them a little more so that your levels are in such a way that are easy to describe. And then there's your clearly define them. And clearly define them means in the system, in the database, looking at every single permission and making sure we know which permissions are assigned to these, but then also being able to say that to somebody that asks the question, what is the difference between a cat admin and a cat master? And be able to say that in few enough words that is also a clear answer. So those are the goals. And that's where we are now. It's now that we've been through all of this review, how do we start tackling these three goals? So there's our scope so far. I'm not wrapping up. It looks like this is a wrap up slide. It's the wrap up, the talk of the scope. And then I'm going to talk about recommendations. So we've analyzed the permissions. We've done all of that. We've analyzed the permission groups, how they're assigned currently. We know every permission right now that's assigned to every permission group and how they've been assigned. We've looked at the report. We've done the presentation. We've now shared those with you that are available here on the user group site. And now we're continuing efforts to look at recommendations and where we go from here. So recommendations. And I will say these recommendations are included in the written report. There are conversations I've had with the board. Nothing has been voted on yet, I should say. So these are just things that are out there for consideration. There's nothing that has been acted upon. No changes have been made in the database, either the test or production database. No implementation plans have been approved. These are simply the things that came out of our review and our conversations together. We said these are the things we would want to look at as our next steps, is to entertain these recommendations and to make sure there's nothing else that, from my point of view, that how I can support providing the information needed to continue working on these recommendations. So we said we weren't going to, with patrons, it was not a lot of review that needed to happen here, but there were a couple of things, and this just repeats what I said there, to remove the secondary permission groups and then implement patron stat caps if we needed. That's just a recap of note from earlier, but it did make it into the recommendations. There are 2 patron permission groups that live outside of that structure that we talked about, that non-circuit outreach. So one of those is to bring them into alignment under patrons. I should say there's a lot more detail about each one of these recommendations in the document, the other document that's shared here with this session, that is the one that I presented to the board, that talks about implementation potential plans for implementing all of these. All of them take caution into consideration about not making changes without reviewing policies to make sure that nothing we're suggesting would negatively affect policy. So we start talking about moving them around in patron groups, that sort of thing, even for patrons and staff. So there is a level of caution that's implemented in these recommendations. It's not just roguely going, make changes, but these recommendations you'll see are just really the end result, is what we're hoping for. Recommendation 3 came about most recently because we started working with the 2 incoming libraries that are still in progress, with Mississippi County and St. Joseph, who that have been in progress since the first of the year. One of the things we found is that both of them came back with the same question: what's the difference between a staff work account and a staff patron account? And so one of the challenges that we added to our list of things we wanted to review is how can we more clearly identify that? Maybe it's just a matter of implementing language to help with that, to identify staff work account versus staff patron account. And part of the implementation process being able for the onboarding group there at Missouri Evergreen to provide a little more guidance on that. Excuse me. Okay, back. And then starting with our staff recommendations. First of all, the simple one: remove unused staff permission groups. Currently, it looks like data review and serials are not being used. So that's easy, low-hanging fruit, as they say. Then we looked at all of those acquisitions permission groups, and we said we really probably need to reclassify some of those so that you don't have quite as many, and then streamline them so that they all fall under staff. And again, Diane's been working on that. Again, what her staff that do acquisitions currently are using and what they might need to help us tackle this particular recommendation. So again, that's just been a little more insight that we're getting on how they're being used, talking to the people that are actually doing the work. So we will take that into consideration as we're working with Diane on this one, and anybody else that's using acquisitions, and with now with St. Joseph as they're coming on. So there's the acquisitions recommendation. Then there's the administration recommendation. Recognizing there are 3, and recognizing that there is a lot of confusion around what each of these things do. And remember, before they are listed as, I think it's local, system, and global is what you have now. We've just had a conversation with the board and made the suggestion, and we believe we probably move forward with this kind of different distinction between the 3 groups. And to do so, we probably needed to rename them. So to do that, in our heads, we're now thinking, in our part of our conversation, is the 3 different things when you're talking about an administrative kind of task is, are you a consortial administrator? Are you somebody like Liz or Mickey who needs to be able to go in there and be able to see and move around all of your libraries? Or the board even, to be able to see what's going on with all these permissions? Are you a local system administrator? So do you have multiple libraries in your system and you need to be able to set policies for multiple libraries? Are you a library director at a single library system? So those are those three things we thought perhaps make it easier just from reading the descriptions to distinguish between what is global and system and local. What does that really mean? So being able to focus on those three things, our goal is to now say exactly what do each of those administrator positions need. So that's where we'll start from, but that's the recommendation, is to kind of clarify that by first saying, who are these really for? What are they, who are they intended for? And what does Missouri Evergreen need administrator accounts for? And in what way will they best serve each type of library in the consortium? And this is where we are now, is creating these renaming, repurposing these three groups that are there now and just giving them a little more focus that is clearly uniquely Missouri Evergreen. And then do something similar with these different permission groups you have. Remember, you have that top level of staff. There's also a general staff permission, and then there's circulators. And so after that, excuse me, that administrator review, we would look at these three, general staff and circulators. Sorry, I've hit my limit with talking, I'm afraid. Okay, and then we would do the same thing there so that we can clearly identify a baseline. And then beyond that, a sip of water, we would look at, what is that circulation administrator? What do we need there? Again, in some libraries, there may not be a big distinction between what a circ manager or circ administrator may do as opposed to circulators. But in some libraries, there is very much a need to have a circ manager role that has additional permissions beyond just beyond what the circ desk people have, that you have a circulation manager who does and should have additional level of permissions. So that would be another recommendation, to look at all of those in tandem. And they're catalogers, so you kind of get the idea of where we're going here. Cataloger permission groups have already been reviewed with the implementation of the cataloger certification program. And so this recommendation is just to make sure that the current permission groups align with what that certification program very much is already clearly stated should be permissions. Just make sure they're all assigned at the correct level. And then review the inherited permissions to make sure that nothing's sneaking in there that wasn't expected. And then almost lastly, there's that group, there's this volunteers group. And the question there is, what libraries are using this? What do you want to use it for? And future looking, what might you want to use it for? Recognizing that some small libraries are absolutely dependent upon volunteers. And making sure that this is a consortial understanding of what permissions are being assigned to volunteers and what do you need this kind of permission group to be able to do. Well, that's how long I've been muted. Did you hear me on recommendation 8 or 9? Do I need to go back?
Nope, we got you.
Okay, I just hit mute buttons. Okay. Whew, man. 10, lastly. 9, I did volunteers, yes. 10 is a more general note here. Just we'd very much like to be able to provide reports at the end of this particular project so that you have many already, but then be able to share them to assist with kind of consortial and library management for monitoring the assignment of permission groups. So you should all be able to pull the reports. You've got a nice arsenal of shared reports already, but to assist you in being able to see what permission groups are assigned to your staff now. And I know you already have something like that, but beyond that, being able to see who has specific permissions, not just permission groups. Okay, next steps. Let's review all the recommendations, act on the quick wins, prioritize others, and then put the others out here for internal discussion, get input from membership. A couple of things on my plate to provide that detailed individual permission suggestions for admin groups. So permission by permission by permission to give us a starting point, what to look at there for each of those three. So you can start thinking about how you want to act on those. Also, I'll be monitoring support tickets coming into Equinox for any permission related matters so that I can provide assistance there, keeping it in alignment with what we're discussing as part of this project. And then also I'll update the original grids that we did since they're now just a couple of months old and see if there are any changes that we need to identify. And then there's just implementation, making sure that we are clearly keeping in mind we need to communicate and document any changes that are considered. Ultimately providing very clear definitions on these staff permission groups, especially for incoming libraries or new library directors. After we get through the administration group review, which has been prioritized, then the additional analysis and focus will work in that order. And we've talked about that in the recommendations, but general staff, circ, and cataloging. And I believe that's it. Was that the end of my next steps? Yes, that's plenty of steps. So let's stop at the steps. And I'll there for about 15 minutes for question and answer.
A question. The acquisitions permissions
Yes,
were not understaffed.
correct. Some of them aren't. Some
Right.
are.
They're wrong.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say that, but Diane did. Yeah, you're right. So they're not these are not understaffed, but these are. They will be. That's the recommendation. They should be.
Okay.
Good question. Thank you for asking. Notice.
I just have a general question for the entire group. When talking with volunteers, is it a liability issue having volunteers in the database accessing patron records?
Yes.
That was gonna be my question as well, because my question was, I understand that some of these libraries rely on those, but is there a way? And if you're comfortable with them perhaps seeing your patron records, okay, but they have access to all of our patron records. So your decision is allowing them to see my patrons, or can we limit that to only those volunteer libraries patrons, which I kind of doubt.
No, it's a big issue because I have a safe at home mom. And her crazy person is trying to get to her, decided to volunteer anywhere in the state of Missouri. He would have access to where she actually is.
It seems like they should more likely fit just under patrons, somewhere in that under patrons. As opposed to staff.
Things they can't do, like
They would be able to
Right,
override
right.
something.
I just something that we really need to discuss as consortium about volunteers and their access to the database. That's concerning to me. I know the reason for volunteers, don't get me wrong. I totally understand volunteers are needed, especially in your small libraries, but I don't know. And I don't even know how many people would be using that category.
But
And
like
maybe
Terry's
they could.
illustration, one person is too many.
Right. But I think that needs to be a further discussion in the consortium membership as to.
So I have a general question, do volunteers go through a background check?
Not a little,
Maybe.
not a little tiny libraries, no, definitely.
Okay,
That's
my question.
I mean,
That's definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a reason why a volunteer would need to have access to the database. And
Some little libraries have them actually check out this, check it out.
right.
You're the mayor, I agree, you're gonna go no.
Yeah, and so we can really go down this rabbit hole really fast, and I don't want to take away from Jennifer's presentation and the point she's trying to make to better our consortium by outlining and designating our permissions, and it just, when we get to volunteers, we're gonna have a more in-depth discussion.
Terry York had a question in the chat, which I'll read to you, Jennifer. What should we be doing at our libraries to help with this process?
Well, at this point, I would say it would be very important to know what staff permissions are assigned to your staff already. And I believe you probably went through this in February. And again, Diane sent out even more good information when there's a report that's out there that's available to help you do that. It's a share report. And then be thinking about what makes your libraries unique and special, what you need. So when that question comes back to you, as library directors or people that make the decisions about assigning permissions, but what do you need? And the big ones are going to be the administrative permissions we're going to talk about first. And then the second one's going to be the distinctions between circulation. What levels of distinction are needed there? Because that's going to be the next question that comes. So it's a great question, Terry, a very great question. And I, of course, am not the authority on this. I'm just sharing some of the thoughts we've had already in our preliminary discussions. So I would just lead with that, to be thinking about, first of all, what have you assigned your staff currently and is it working? And secondly, what kind of distinctions do you wish were there that are not currently? I know we're at a point now to where if you want to be able to give everybody everything you think you want them to have, sometimes they're getting a lot more than they know they have and that perhaps you think they should, but it's just the way to go. You know, for example, if you're giving somebody sysadmin, sometimes that's necessary just to be able to provide every bit of permission that's needed. So it's a long answer to stay, just be thinking about what you really need and if it's working for you now. And then I would defer, of course, to the board there to answer in greater detail.
Then membership meetings and hear your voice. That would be a good way to get involved in the whole conversation and make sure that your library is being represented.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and I most appreciate you're doing this presentation with most of your voice gone and not feeling good.
Oh, you're most welcome. I'm glad that it held on for most of the. I'm getting to my thank you notes.
And thank
Yeah.
you. We are so appreciative of this project and of your work on it. And I think that sharing this with the membership is really crucial as we start, as you said, implementing these decisions. They will have effects on how we do our work at the library. So thank you for being so thoughtful of that. I think it's so important to us in Missouri Evergreen that our members drive the process and are involved in the process. And then ultimately they're going to be affected by it. So thank you for taking that into consideration.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. And thank you for having me here the last 2 days. I've enjoyed it. Great job putting this together.